Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack, by Ralph Blumenthal, narrated by Phil Thron. I never said it was possible, I only said it was true. Sir William Crookes, 1874. 1. They are telling the truth. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology sprawls along the southern coast of Cambridge, facing patrician Back Bay, Boston, across a wide spot of the Charles River. On its northwest shoulder, around a bend in the river, hunkers Harvard University. But MIT alone never really had an outdoors, not one that anyone uses, writes architecture critic Robert Campbell of the Boston Globe. Its 166 acres are pocketed with quadrangles of greenery and classical courts carved with the names of Newton, Aristotle, and Copernicus, but they seem superfluous. The nearest thing to a public space, a place of social and cultural gathering, is the so-called infinite corridor indoors. Here, MIT's scientists labor on their studies, which, to date, have been honored with 95 Nobel Prizes. In this inquiring spirit, on an unseasonably hot Saturday in June 1992, an unlikely assembly convened for 5 days of secretive conferencing. Filling the steeply banked seats of Lecture Hall 6120 in the Eastman Laboratories, where a lobby plaque pays homage to the storied MIT benefactor, Kodak photo pioneer George Eastman, were dozens of doctors, psychologists, therapists, physicists, folklorists, historians, theologians, and other specialists, a handful of trusted journalists, and 16 otherwise seemingly ordinary folk with extraordinary experiences. All had signed non-disclosure agreements for the event that would remain under wraps for 2 more years, until the publication of a thick, oversized volume called Alien Discussions, Proceedings of the Abduction Study Conference. The conference was a professional forum about humans who believed they were, at a minimum, 1. Taken against their will by non-human beings, 2. Brought to an apparent spacecraft or other enclosed space, 3. Examined or subjected to a telepathic communication, and 4. Could recall the experience consciously or under hypnosis. Some further recounted astral travels, ecstatic bonding with a deity or source, apocalyptic warnings of planetary doom, and the forcible harvesting of their eggs or sperm for human-alien hybrid reproduction. It was hardly MIT's regular fare, although the school's fabled science fiction society hosted the world's largest open-shelf library of more than 60,000 science fiction and fantasy books and magazines, and, to be sure, MIT was not a sponsor. Rather, in the spirit of academic freedom, it only granted use of its facilities after a distinguished MIT atomic physicist, David E. Pritchard, pointed out how bad censorship would look. Renowned for his pioneering research in the wave-like properties of beams of atoms and forces of light on atoms, Pritchard, a prize-winning mentor of Nobelists, had long been intrigued by the abduction narratives, which he saw as more amenable to scientific investigation than sightings of what were long called flying saucers, or, more accurately, unidentified flying objects, UFOs. He had been reading up on the subject and used his travels in physics to consult with leading investigators of the phenomenon. At first, Pritchard thought of writing a book, but he later decided that a critical analysis of all the possibilities really demanded a conference. With a sabbatical at hand, Pritchard devoted the semester to planning it, ignoring the hostility of MIT administrators and enlisting as his partner a noted Harvard psychiatrist named John E. Mack, who had begun his own abduction investigations. Given the evident psychological dimensions of the phenomenon, Pritchard said, I would not have had the courage to run this without a prominent psychiatrist. Mack was a Harvard star, a heralded founder of community mental health services in once downtrodden Cambridge, and the author of a groundbreaking psychological biography of Lawrence of Arabia that had won a Pulitzer Prize. Commandingly tall at 62 years of age, and with crystalline blue eyes and a face stretched tight over his skull like the leathery mask of some totemic figure, he packed lecture halls and seminars, attracted disciples, particularly women, published prolifically, mobilized colleagues against nuclear weapons, and traveled the world on missions of peace. He had met with Yasser Arafat and been arrested at a nuclear test site in Nevada, and he was just back from the Himalayas, where he had joined a select group of professionals discussing aliens with His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. Now Mack told the conferees at MIT why he thought the abduction phenomenon was not a psychiatric phenomenon, although that was most people's snap assumption, including, at first, his own. But any explanation, he said, had to account for 5 elements. 1. Consistency of the reports. 2. Physical signs like scars and witness-backed reports of actual absence for a time. 3. Accounts from children too young for delusional psychiatric syndromes. 4. An association with witnessed UFOs. And 5. The lack of any consistent psychopathology among abductees. To the uninformed, it appeared like mass hysteria fed by the culture, Mack said. Except this didn't act like a collective disorder. The experiences were too personal, involving isolated individuals not caught up in any mass movement, and they were risking ostracism and ridicule. There is no evidence that anything other than what abductees are telling us has happened to them, Mack said. The people with whom I have been working, as far as I can tell, are telling the truth, and this has been the impression of other abduction researchers. It was indeed a profound mystery. Some sort of intelligence seems to have entered our world as if from another dimension of reality. As for the beings themselves, they were commonly described at the conference as hairless and without ears or noses, although apertures were visible. The cranium was large and bulbous, set on a thin neck like a ball on a stick. The eyes were the most striking feature, huge, opaque, and inky black, with no eyebrows, lashes, or lids. The mouth was a lipless, toothless slit, not used for speaking or apparently eating or drinking. The chin was pointed, the jaw unhinged, with no sign of musculature. The faces bore no lines or wrinkles or other signs of aging. The body, too, was devoid of muscular development, with no sign of skeletal structure, no shoulder blades or ribs. There were no visible breasts or nipples, no bulge of a stomach, no waistline, no hips, no buttocks, and no apparent genitals, just a smooth, rounded area. Nor were there any signs of male-female differentiation. Arms and legs were spindly, without joints, the limbs just bending where a knee or elbow would be. The hands had 3 or 4 fingers and an opposable thumb. The feet were covered. The skin was widely described as gray and rubbery, with no visible pores. Were they even biological creatures, or robots? But if they were robots, they could communicate and think at least as well as humans. They could make decisions and deal with crises. Word of the conference had leaked out, and many of Mack's Harvard colleagues were incredulous or appalled. He was lending his professional eminence to this? Some were less surprised, knowing Mack as a maverick who had taken to heart the lines of the Spanish poet Antonio Machado, "Traveler, there is no path. You make the path by walking." Years of the psychoanalysis that his profession demanded of practitioners had excavated the childhood trauma that Mack himself believed lay behind his lifelong questing and openness to the anomalous. He had lost his mother at a tender age, leaving him wounded by abandonment. And so he came to tell a Brazilian therapist in a flash of insight that may have come out a little too pat, "The abduction story is a welcoming story because it means that, oh, I'm getting goose pimples as I think of this, I'm not alone. There is life in the universe." 2. Terror in the Night. Behavioral scientist David J. Hufford was inclined to reject his invitation to the Alien Discussions Forum at MIT, not because he was skeptical of UFOs or paranormal experiences — he had good reason to be open-minded — but because he was leery of the research methods employed, particularly hypnotic regression. Abduction theory, he felt, had gotten way out in front of its data and demanded far more rigorous investigation. It was, at the very least, part of something far bigger and more unruly that could confuse people who were grappling with unresolved traumas, real or imagined. But Hufford, a folklore Ph.D. and a professor at Pennsylvania State's College of Medicine, joined the conference, after all, and came to share what he knew, which was the phenomenon of awakening paralyzed in the presence of a malevolent being. He had, to his terror, unaccountably experienced it himself as a student in the 1960s, after which he had gone on to study the experience in Newfoundland, where it was surprisingly prevalent and known as the old hag syndrome, nocturnal visitations by evil presences seemingly bent on strangling or suffocating immobilized victims. There were enough parallels with alien abduction to raise eyebrows. And yet, Hufford lamented, abduction investigators were overlooking connections that pointed to a larger and more complex syndrome, as explored in his groundbreaking 1982 book on supernatural assault traditions, The Terror That Comes in the Night. Hufford had implicated a recognized medical condition known as sleep paralysis, when the highly brain-active and dream-rich sleep stage known as rapid eye movement combines with muscle atony or paralysis as people fall asleep or awaken. When he began his research in 1970, medical literature estimated the prevalence of sleep paralysis in the general population at about 1%. He was able to show it was about 20 times higher. In fact, he came to think, sleep paralysis seemed so central to the old hag visitations that it clamored for examination in abductions, although not all abductions occurred during sleep. Sleep paralysis didn't explain the paranormal experiences, but somehow they intersected. Hufford knew that some anomalous experiences were conventionally explainable. A 1980s outbreak of sudden nocturnal deaths among healthy Southeast Asian men aged 30 to 45 had been ascribed by the refugee community to threatening spirits that paralyzed victims as they slept. Hufford founded a condition of sleep paralysis turned fatal by genetically linked cardiac conduction defect, a disruption of the electrical impulses that control the heartbeat. Similarly, Hufford said, a study in the journal Nature of mermen sightings from medieval Norse ships found that the sightings decreased as the height of the ships grew, implicating optical distortions in transformations of walruses and killer whales into magical semi-humans. He cautioned against relying on so-called star informants, whose accounts were most alluring. The study of disbelievers or marginal experiencers was crucial as well. Why didn't they encounter what others had? He saw UFOs as part of contemporary folk belief. Not that they weren't objectively real. They were as real as other anomalous phenomena dismissed by the prevailing scientific paradigm, which couldn't, after all, disprove their existence, but could only hold that they didn't fit into any reality that science at the time could recognize. Abduction investigators, even someone as well-trained as Mack, as Hufford saw it, were too restrictive in settling on just one manifestation of a far broader and more complex set of core experiences known to humanity since earliest antiquity. He found it curious, in fact, that investigators of alien abduction seemed almost rivalrous with those who studied, say, Bigfoot, or near-death experiences, or religious revelations, as if those were competing phenomena in a zero-sum game and not part of a bigger enveloping mystery. Hufford also distrusted hypnotic regression as a tool to explore abduction experiences, or any anomalies for that matter. It was just unreliable. If you ask a person to remember something, they will, he said. Some memories under hypnosis are valid, some are not. Yet he was far from a debunker. Many who shared their experiences with Hufford had never heard of the old hag, so they couldn't be circulating a cultural meme. One young woman recalled waking up to a male figure pinning her to the bed. She remembered its distinctive smell, sweaty and kind of dusty. Its face was covered by a white mask with black dots and a red kind of crooked mouth. She tried to scream, but no sound would come out. A male college student recalled a murky presence, like a blob of nothing, with no real face but two holes that seemed to be eyes. 3 young college women shared a Kentucky house rumored to be haunted. They described many frightening encounters, including a night when one of them felt overcome with images of mass murder and struggled to resist an evil presence urging her to slaughter her roommates. She actually saw herself chopping them up. Counterintuitively, throughout her terror, her dog showed no sign of distress, unlike many pets and farm animals in abduction scenarios. But like abduction narratives, old hag experiences often had a sexual component. The bed often rocked. Sufferers felt vibrations or out-of-body sensations of flying up and seeing themselves below. Time seemed out of joint, passing slowly. Some of the creatures seemed to shuffle or walk with a rolling gait reminiscent of aliens in abductee accounts. Hufford had a personal reason to take the phenomenon seriously. In 1963, as a sophomore of Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, he had completed his final exams for the semester and collapsed into bed in his off-campus room at 6 p.m. 2 hours later, he was awakened by the sound of his door being opened and then footsteps. The room was pitch black. Hufford assumed a friend was looking for him for dinner. He tried to turn on the light, but couldn't move or speak. He felt the mattress sink as something climbed up, knelt on his chest, and proceeded to strangle him. Terrified, he thought he would die. Whatever it was, it reeked with evil, leaving Hufford revolted. He fought his paralysis and then suddenly found he could move. He leapt out of bed and switched on the light. The room was empty. He ran down to the landlord, who was casually sitting and watching TV. "Did someone go past you just now?" Hufford asked. The landlord looked at him strangely and said no. Then Hufford really panicked. He told no one, but in 1970, while studying supernatural belief for his doctorate, he traveled to Newfoundland, where he found that many people had experienced the old hag. It upended his thinking. He had been taught that supernatural experiences grew out of local traditions, the so-called cultural source hypothesis. But he knew from his own experience that an encounter can occur with no predisposition whatsoever. He didn't want to share what had happened to him, but he now realized that strange things didn't happen to people because they believed in strange things. They believed in strange things because strange things happened to them. 3. This Bud's for You. John Mack had come late to the UFO/abduction game, which was a stupefying enigma any way you looked at it, newly resurfaced and yet, some said, timelessly archetypal. The phenomenon may indeed have been ageless, but the involvement of a laureled Harvard professor of psychiatry was a fresh sensation. Grappling with psychological issues from the traumatic loss of his mother in infancy, He had been studying a relaxation technique called holotropic breathwork, a technique in which breathing is regulated by rhythmic music with the aim of inducing altered states of consciousness. Holotropic breathwork was developed by a charismatic Czech-born psychiatrist, Stanislav Grof, and his wife, Christina, and it opened Mack up to a range of spiritual experiences. Years later, he would say everything went back to the Grofs. They put a hole in my psyche and the UFOs flew in. At a Grof training module in California in late 1989, Mack had met a fellow psychotherapist from New York who shared with Mack the story of a patient who had written an operetta set in an institution where inmates received head implants so they could be tracked. The psychotherapist, Blanche Chavasty, who came to believe she was a victim of the CIA's Project MK-Ultra, the sinister Cold War mind control experiments later devastatingly exposed by Congress, had read about abductions. The composer's case offered some eerie parallels, and Chavasty had consulted an artist friend, Bud Hopkins, who, after a UFO sighting of his own, had become a noted writer on abductions. Hopkins asked Chavasty to bring her patient to his townhouse art studio in Manhattan's Chelsea section. And then, Chavasty said, Hopkins used hypnosis to retrieve the woman's history of alien encounters. Would Mack like to meet Hopkins? Chavasty asked. Mack scoffed. It sounded crazy, but Chavasty persisted. She told Hopkins about Mack and followed up with a postcard saying Mack would be in New York in January and asking could Hopkins meet with him. Mack forgot about it. But on a cold and blustery Wednesday, on January 10th, 1990, one of the dates when your life changes, Mack said later, he was in Manhattan visiting his old Harvard friend and fellow psychoanalyst Robert J. Lifton. Now Mack remembered Hopkins and, somewhat to his own surprise, called him after all. Hopkins invited him over, and Mack asked if Lifton wanted to come along. Lifton and Hopkins were neighbors on Cape Cod. Hopkins had a studio in Truro, not far from Wellfleet, where Lifton and his wife, Betty Jean, known as B.J., summered. B.J. spoke up for her husband. "No," she said, like a Cassandra, "Bob has a choice about getting involved in this, and you don't." Hopkins, affable and bushy-browed with a shag of lanky, graying hair, greeted Mack in his West 16th Street townhouse, which was hung with his flat, knife-bladed geometric sculptures in bright primary colors, his guardians, as Hopkins called them. He told Mack a haunting story. A troubled woman had come to see him and spotted a drawing of an alien face, teardrop-shaped with huge black wraparound insect eyes. "How did he know?" she gasped. "Know what?" "My experience," she said. The picture was from someone else, Hopkins said. That really jolted her. She had been telling herself she'd suffered a nightmare. If she wasn't alone, maybe it was real after all. There were many like her, Hopkins told Mack. He had letters from his readers all over the country detailing the most unearthly encounters, too unimaginably bizarre to make up. Mack could read them for himself. Hopkins sent him off with a batch and one of Hopkins's books, inscribed in the artist's near-spastic scrawl, "For John, with every good wish to a future, I hope, colleague, Bud Hopkins." Mack was about to leave the country, so he didn't immediately study the material. But when he did, he was indeed intrigued. He quickly collected his own circle of experiencers, a term he and others preferred as more neutral than abductee. When he heard their accounts and evaluated them as a psychiatrist, he found nothing inherently wrong with them. They harbored certain resentments, suspiciousness, feelings of victimization, and tendencies to challenge authority, and they came from homes with troubled parental relationships, alcoholism, and varied forms of abuse. That is, Mack said, they reflected a typical cross-section of humanity. In other words, they were normal. Where there was disturbance, it seemed caused by the abduction experiences, not vice versa. And with his psychiatric experience, shouldn't he know? "That's my job," he was to tell his Sikh guru, Gurucharan Singh Khalsa, a bushy-bearded Kundalini yoga expert and a disciple of the Indian yogic master Yogi Bhajan. Khalsa had been Mack's friend, counselor, and psychotherapist since they had met in Cambridge in the 1980s and bonded over a shared interest in mind-body interactions. "If you're an art dealer, your job would be to tell the real thing from the copy," Mack said. Anyway, he said, "What's the payoff? Why in the world, or out of it, would anyone make this up? It would be wrong to say this was a sort of gradually dawning realization," Mack would later tell an interviewer. He could see where it was going the moment he met Hopkins. Mack soon introduced two women with abduction encounters to an affect seminar he was running at Harvard to explore feelings in the face of traumatic experiences. He had been cautioned by an old family friend, Thomas Kuhn, to stay skeptical. Kuhn had taught the history of science at Harvard before joining the University of California, Berkeley, and writing The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, his classic study on the resistance of established science to unconventional breakthroughs. "Hold on to the null hypothesis as long as possible," Kuhn urged Mack. "View any hypothesis as something to be disproved. Gather evidence, but postpone conclusions until 3 smoking guns." Yet, in early 1991, barely a year after meeting Hopkins, Mack was discussing his own abduction research at a shop club, a Harvard dinner forum for works in progress, and he was provoking consternation. Wasn't this just witchcraft, mass delusion, hysteria? Someone raised the dubious reincarnation claims of a Colorado housewife who had conjured a previous life as an 18th-century Irish woman, Bridie Murphy. Thrown on the defensive, Mack cited the scraps of elusive physical evidence and the abductee's deep distress that to him, as a psychiatrist, had the authentic effect of a real experience and not a fantasy. Willard Van Orman Quine, an 82-year-old Harvard philosopher and theoretician of abstruse mathematical formulations, had listened, stumped. How was it possible? Another listener, the philosopher, ethicist, and psychologist Cicely Bach, wife of Harvard's president Derek Bach and daughter of the Nobel Prize winners Gunnar and Alva Myrtle, were also intrigued. But she objected to Mack's certainties and impatience with critics, especially since no one had the slightest idea what this was all about. Mack shrugged off her concern. In fact, he thought, it might soon be time to lay it out more publicly. 4. The Mystery of Anomalous Experience. Wesley Boyd, 6'3" with a beard and ponytail, was in his final months of medical school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, while also completing a doctorate in religion and culture. The elemental duality, science and soul, the mirror and the lamp. Now, at the end of 1991, with Boyd considering a residency in psychiatry, his professor at UNC, Jeffrey Andreson, had a strong recommendation: the Cambridge Hospital, run by Harvard Medical School. That's where his favorite psychiatry teacher at Massachusetts Mental Health Center, Mass Mental, once known as Boston Psychopathic Hospital, or the Psycho, was teaching now. John Mack, Andreson said, was brilliant. Tall and restless, with cobalt eyes and a spiritual, intellectual, and sexual chemistry, he had been Andreson's idol. At a time when Cambridge was a blue-collar healthcare wasteland where the only mental illness problem was considered Harvard, Mack, bursting with enthusiasm, had convinced the chairman of the Harvard Department of Psychiatry in Boston to leap the Charles River and adopt the forlorn hospital. Soon, under Mack, the struggling community was blessed with mental health clinics and addiction treatment centers and counseling for poor children, and the Cambridge Hospital began winning awards. Mack continued his ascent through the Harvard firmament while toiling a dozen years in England and the Middle East on a groundbreaking...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?